After weeks of negotiations and a delay to his trip, President Biden is heading to Europe with a framework for his signature spending plan. He was on Capitol Hill Thursday morning, lobbying House Democrats to embrace his scaled-back social and climate investment bill. He is asking them to look at what was gained from the status quo, not what was lost from the original proposal.
I've long said compromise and consensus are the only way to get big things done in a democracy, important things done for the country. I know it's hard. I know how deeply people feel about the things that they fight for. But this framework includes historic investments in our nation and in our people.
The president expressed hope in securing the votes both for his spending plan and the bipartisan infrastructure bill. But there is still resentment among some progressive Democrats about the influence Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema hold over the process.
The problem is not with the president. The problem is with members here who, although they are very few in number, they are a significant minority, think that they have a right to determine what the rest of the Congress should be doing.
Some progressive Democrats are still threatening to vote against the infrastructure bill as House Democratic leadership pushes toward a vote. They argue it needs to be passed in tandem with the social spending plan, and without assurances, they're not willing to lend their support. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi remained optimistic about the progress.
I'm so proud of the work that our chairs have done and the work that everybody did to try to cut it in half, and in a way that we could maintain support for it, because that is competition for the dollar, even at $3.5 trillion. When you cut it in half, it becomes, shall we say, keener.
The division is fueling questions about the will of the party. House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn, the party's third highest ranking member, said the infighting does not indicate good things for Democrats' midterm hopes.
My dad used to say to me all the time, son, wherever there is a will, there is a way. So I'm not too sure that Democrats have yet developed the will to win in 2022. In order for us to win in 2022, we're going to have to get beyond our comfort zones.
Here's how House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy tried to capitalize on his opposition's internal issues.
I wonder if President feels a little like Charlie Brown in that famous scene with the football. His advisors tell him to come back up to the hill. They promise this time Speaker Pelosi won't pull it out from under her. But we'll find out today if she does the exact same thing. You know, I agree with the House Majority Whip who said, I'm not too sure that the Democrats have yet developed the will to win in 2022. So as the lame duck speaker jets around the world on her farewell tour and puts together a multi-trillion-dollar bill in her office, you have to wonder, how long until the rest of the Democrats wake up?
Let's bring in Nancy Cordes, Sean Sullivan, and David Drucker. Nancy is CBS News chief White House correspondent, traveling with the president in Rome. Sean is a CBS News political contributor and White House reporter for The Washington Post. And David is a senior congressional correspondent for The Washington Examiner and author of In Trump's Shadow, The Battle for 2024 and the Future of the GOP. Welcome. It's great to have you all. Nancy, let me start with you. How confident is the White House in getting this revamped spending bill passed?
Well, they are projecting extreme confidence, Elaine, tonight. They are saying that they now believe they have locked in the votes that they're going to need from House and Senate Democrats in order to get this bill across the finish line. But there are still so many things that could go wrong between now and then. Remember that the text of this bill, it's about 2,000 pages. It just came out, and any one of those members thumbing through the text could find something that they consider egregious, that could slow down the process, that could prompt another round of negotiations. And then even if all Democrats are on board, we still need to wait to hear what the Congressional Budget Office has to say about all of this before they could even take a vote, because this bill cannot go through the reconciliation process in the Senate unless it is revenue neutral, unless it doesn't add any more money to the deficit. And it's going to take the CBO at least a week to go through all of these new plans, some of which we're only hearing about today for the first time, to figure out exactly how much it's going to cost and how much it's going to raise.
So, Sean, where does this leave progressives? How are they feeling about this spending bill?
Well, I think we're hearing a mix of reactions today. There's certainly disappointment in the progressive movement that this bill is a long way from where it started. You know, it wasn't that long ago that we were talking about a $6 trillion bill that then became a $3.5 trillion bill. And now we're talking about $1.75 trillion. In the grand scheme of things, that is still a lot of money. And the kind of investments that we're talking about in the domestic agenda are big and in many ways historic. But you know, there were a lot of members of the Progressive Caucus, liberal activists, who wanted to see bigger, broader changes enacted. They felt, look, this might be our last chance, maybe in years, to enact the kind of things that we have talked about doing but have been unable to do for years. And these are things like expanding Medicare. You know, Senator Sanders, for a long time, has talked about expanding Medicare for seniors to offer dental coverage, to offer hearing and vision coverage. Well, it turns out they have to now compromise, and they will only be covering hearing in this measure. There has been talk about free community college. We're not seeing free community college tuition in this package. And there are other things, I think, that come as a disappointment to some progressive. All that said, it does sound somewhat encouraging for the president that there are leading members of the Progressive Caucus who are overall welcoming this bill. They're saying, look, didn't get everything we wanted, but in the end, this is something that we're going to need to rally around. It remains to be seen if everybody gets on board, and the margin is so slim in the House for Democrats, given this narrow majority, that they can't really afford to lose many members at all. So I think the White House right now is encouraged, but I think they're very cautiously optimistic because, as Nancy pointed out, any number of things could go wrong. Any number of twists and turns could, you know, put these negotiations off the rails. So it's a very sensitive and delicate negotiation process right now. But no doubt the White House is looking squarely at liberal members of Congress right now, trying to assess where they are, because they're going to play a key role in deciding whether this ultimately passes or whether it fails.
Well, David, as Sean laid out, I mean, quite a bit has been scaled back from this bill, but that price tag is still pretty big, $1.75 trillion. So at this point, is it clear how the president intends to pay for that?
I don't think that's clear, and I think we need to see more legislative language. We need to see more than just a framework to understand that, and that might tell us exactly how much public support this bill ends up having. I think what's really fascinating here is that the president has really laid it all out on the line. He met with House Democrats this morning in Washington before jetting off to Rome and told them, my presidency is on the line. Our ability to govern as a party is on the line. What are you going to do? And then just a couple hours later at the White House, he declares victory and says, Democrats have agreed to this framework and everything is going to pass. And in a sense, he's almost daring his party to make him look like a fool, and daring them really to make them look like fools, because what the American people are looking at, whether it's higher inflation, concern about public schools, lingering concern about the coronavirus pandemic, is they're looking for more help. The GDP numbers today weren't that great. Right now, it's at a 2% annual growth rate. And so the president needs to do a lot, and Democrats need to do a lot to make the case that they are delivering on the issues that the American people care about. And people may not be aware of all of the intricate rules of reconciliation and why we use that word and all of the details about the infighting. But I think that it would help Democrats immensely and help the president if they had some work product, if they could deliver something that at least they could say, I've passed this bill, we're spending these tax dollars, they are going to help you with some of your problems. And people would start to feel again like there was some confidence in the White House. It would help Democrats. And I think that's why so many progressives at least were talking about this idea that they can live with this reduced bill at $1.75 trillion even though they would have liked something more. And now it's a matter, if they can get all of their ducks in a row, trust each other, and try and do something. One thing, Elaine, that's hanging out there, and it's not just the trip in Rome that the president in Glasgow, Scotland, where the president's headed in the coming days. There's an election in Virginia, and if the Democratic nominee for governor loses that race, it's, I think, going to make it harder for the president to bring his party together.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about that. In fact, later in the show, we're going to hear from some Virginia voters because of the potential implications of the outcome of that race. But Nancy, let me turn to you, because Senators Sinema and Manchin have, as we've talked about many times, driven much of the negotiations on this bill. What does the White House say about where they stand?
Well, the White House doesn't have to say anything because they actually did speak for themselves, which is something that Kyrsten Sinema in particular doesn't always do. We don't always know where she is. She put out a statement saying that she's encouraged by the direction that things are heading in, and she's going to continue to work in good faith. Senator Manchin said something similar. He said he's working in good faith. That's all he has to say for today. Now, those comments were notably not a full-throated endorsement of the plan by either Manchin or Sinema. So you did have this disconnect that I think both Sean and David have alluded to, where the White House is saying we're very confident we have everyone on board, and yet the two people they've been negotiating with for weeks, they've made all these concessions for Manchin and Sinema, and yet we weren't hearing Manchin and Sinema say, great, and now we are happy with the plan. I think that's partly because they hadn't seen the legislative language yet. They hadn't seen the nitty-gritty, so they're not going to sign off on it until they see it. But that was the main source of frustration for progressive Democrats, who said they're not going to go ahead and vote on the bipartisan infrastructure plan like House Speaker Nancy Pelosi wanted them to do, because they want to make sure that they have Manchin and Sinema's support on this larger social spending plan. They don't want to take any chances. So it does appear right now that these two big pieces of legislation are going to remain linked. Progressives, just not wanting to take any chances on an agenda item that is so important to them and to the president.
Yeah, Sean, help us understand this a bit, because it has been such a source of tension within the Democratic Party, the linking of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which has cleared the Senate, and the president's spending plan, which has not. Why is it that progressives in particular have so dug in on that issue of linkage? I mean, Nancy touched on it there a moment ago, but how is it that they are viewing this spending plan in particular?
Well, when they look at these two bills, they see an opportunity for leverage here. They see, on the one hand, this social programs plan that they've been negotiating for a very long time. And within this plan, they've wanted to get their priorities passed. And in order to do that, they're going to have to get, as Nancy mentioned, Senators Manchin and Sinema, and they're going to have to get key centrists. And there's been a worry all along among progressives that if they just went ahead, passed this infrastructure bill, that dedicates money to roads, bridges, other public works, has been supported by Republicans, that, maybe centrists will just walk away and say, okay, we've passed this thing. We don't need to pass this other thing. We should move on. We've even heard Senator Manchin himself call for a pause, call for, sort of a rethinking. And so I think the Progressive Caucus in Congress looks at the situation and says, okay, where is our leverage here? If we want to make sure that our bill passes with the votes that it needs, and it includes the things that we want, we got to make sure that we don't clear the way for this other plan. But this has been a real frustration to a lot of centrists. One of them, and perhaps most notably, is Terry McAuliffe, who's running for governor in Virginia, who for weeks has been pleading with national Democrats to say, look, you guys were elected to do things, to get things done. You control all levers of government. House, the Senate, the White House, and you haven't got anything done. We don't have this infrastructure bill. It's left something of a vacuum for him and other Democrats without something to run on. You compound that by the fact that the president's approval ratings are not good right now across the board in Virginia or elsewhere. And it really does leave a lot of anxiety for Democrats. They want something concrete to run on. So as progressives have pushed for their agenda in the social spending bill, that meant putting this other bill on hold, because Speaker Pelosi just doesn't have the votes for it. But a lot of Democrats see a bigger picture where that's put their entire sort of political platform on hold, and they worry that that could be problematic. And the question going into Virginia now is what we're seeing here today, too little, too late to really have a political effect in that race. I think McAuliffe and his allies certainly would have liked to see this kind of thing happen 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, some sort of breakthrough, and then eventually an actual bill that that he and others can campaign on. Because the worry I hear from a lot of Democrats is people don't really know what is in these plans because they're unsettled. And until today, we haven't actually seen a framework or, legislative text that people can sort of agree on in a big way. So it's been hard to explain to voters, if you're a Democrat, what is it that the party's trying to do? What is it that they stand for? It's been confusing. And I think that's why we see the close race in Virginia. At least that's part of the reason why we see that. And that's why we could see, really close races down the line. Democrats look at the midterm elections with a lot of anxiety. They're defending very, very narrow majorities. First midterms are typically very, very difficult for the president's party. So there's a lot of worry right now. What do we run on? What are we going to campaign on? They see this as the centerpiece of that. But to actually run on it, you actually have to enact it. And they haven't done that yet. And part of the reason is this sort of complex push and pull that we're seeing between these two bills and these negotiations.
Nancy, I wonder, it was really interesting to hear House Majority Whip Clyburn talk about the party's will to win, looking ahead to 2022. Is it clear for Democrats what unity actually looks like now?
I think that was something of a warning shot to any progressives who might be inclined to take a look at the Build Back Better framework, the new one, the new one, and say, well, wait a minute, this is not what I signed up for. It doesn't include paid family leave. It doesn't include free community college. It doesn't expand Medicare the way I wanted it to. And so I'm going to dig in, and maybe I'll get some of those things back in the plan. Maybe if I dig in the way Manchin and Sinema did, I might have as much success as they did. And that was sort of a warning to them to say, hey, we can continue to go at this for months and months, but it's only going to hurt the party. And it does appear to have worked. In fact, I think a lot of progressives kind of came to terms a while ago with the fact that this plan was going to be about half the size that President Biden originally envisioned. You did hear a little bit of grumbling, but even Bernie Sanders came out and said, yeah, there are some gaps, but it is the biggest bill of its kind since the 1960s, and I'm going to work to make a good bill even better in these closing days. If you've won over Bernie Sanders and he's saying, perhaps you could tinker around the margins, but it is more or less a good bill, then that's a sign that progressives, by and large, are going to hang in there because they recognize that at this point it is all or nothing. You either take what you've got at 1.75 trillion, or you're going to get no trillions because, clearly the two centrist Democrats that they need to get this over the finish line have been really dug in for a long time.
Yeah, as the president said in that private meeting, so much riding on what happens in these coming days. Nancy Cordes, David Drucker, and Sean Sullivan, thank you all very much.